An unusual runic shape has been seen on the Ruthwell Cross. Raymond Page and others have supposed that this runic shape is an innovative rune which was invented to stand for an allophone of ka in the words kuning and unket. This paper proposes instead that the runic shape may be the result of a mistake which was made twice, noticed, and not repeated. This paper proposes that there is evidence for general confusion and mistakes on the cross concerning the runes Gar and Kalk, along with their parent runes Yivu and Chain. This paper also questions to what degree the strange runic shape actually appears, along with the supposed use for this strange runic shape. Okay, so there are 4 main sides to the Ruthwell Cross, and 2 of them bear runic text. The text is essentially a short version of the Old English poem, The Dream of the Rood, which can be found in the Vercelli book. By comparing the runic text on the Ruthwell Cross with the matching text from The Dream of the Rood, one can make an informed guess as to which side of the cross bears the first half of the runic text, and therefore determine which side's inscription is more likely to have been planned and or carved first. When we map out the representation of Ka on the cross, we are said to find it represented with the strange runic shape twice on the first runic side, and with Kalk twice on the second runic side. Why not Kalk all 4 times? The common explanation is that the first 2 instances of Ka are special allophones of Ka, which appear before secondary fronted vowels. The idea being that the strange runic shape was deliberately invented to stand for this special allophone. I think attributing this strange runic shape to a mistake might be more straightforward. My first issue with interpreting the strange runic shape as a legitimate rune is its design, since if it were an innovative rune invented to stand for an allophone of Ka, then why does Gar, a rune for Ga, seem to serve as its visual base? The strange runic shape is sometimes said to be a mirrored Kalk rune, but a mirrored Kalk would look like the 18th calendar rune, and one has to wonder why this neater and simpler design were not chosen. My second issue with the strange runic shape is its supposed role. It is true that Kalk was invented to stand for an allophone of Ka, which at first makes it seem plausible that the strange runic shape could have been as well. But the invention of Kalk had a real effect, since it allowed people to more easily distinguish between certain clashing pairs like chin and kin. What ambiguity was alleviated by the strange runic shape? What confusion would have arisen, or could have arisen, from writing kuning and unket with the letter Kalk instead of the strange runic shape? One can argue that the strange runic shape may simply have been more fanciful than practical, but that would be unexpected for an epigraphical futhorc text. Futhorc does contain fanciful runes like Queorth and Stan, but these runes are only found in manuscripts, and these manuscripts are notorious for including strange and apparently unused runes in their rune lists. Epigraphical futhorc is rarely as quirky as manuscript futhorc, and its quirkiness is often something it inherited, not invented. The rather unnecessary runes Yer, Ich, and Ilks, for example. Basically, what I'm saying is these runes weren't really useful, but they were still used. They were used and given a purpose when they didn't really have a purpose. Like it looks like this one may have been given the job of standing for allophones of the H sound, and that's really completely unnecessary because the H rune handled those allophones just fine. And this rune may have been repurposed to be a kind of X rune under influence of Latin, which is, not necessary. But these runes were inherited into futhorc. They weren't invented for futhorc. My third issue with the strange runic shape is that it does not appear in manuscripts. Epigraphical futhorc runes rarely escape mention. Nor does the strange runic shape seem to appear anywhere else, including on the Ruthwell Cross's twin, the Bewcastle Cross. This Sengen runic cross is less than 50 kilometers away from Ruthwell, is dated to the same period, and shares strikingly similar, in some places almost identical, depictions of birds and coiling vines. Okay, now I'm gonna show some stuff. Okay, so this is the Bewcastle Cross. If you compare some of these designs with the birds and the vines, you'll see they are basically identical in some places to the Ruthwell Cross. Now, if the strange runic shape were to appear anywhere else in the world, it would probably be here in the name Kuniburuch, because if the Ruthwell Cross has Kuning, and if the Bewcastle Cross has Kunibruch, then this is, basically the exact same context where we would expect to find the strange runic shape, but we don't actually find it here. And this is exactly where we would expect to find it if it were a real rune and if people were actually committing to it and using it in spellings. Okay, returning here. Although most of its runic text is weathered beyond recognition, the name Kuniburuch can still be faintly seen, and old sketches of the cross help to confirm this reading. The spelling is noteworthy because it uses calc where we might expect the strange runic shape. Gaby Waxenberger posits that the strange runic shape may appear elsewhere on the cross in the word Christus, but she also rightly points out that the cross is too weathered to be certain. And old sketches of the cross do not strongly support this reading, nor would such a reading be expected. Okay, so yeah, basically, we would expect to see this strange runic shape on the Bewcastle Cross because the Bewcastle Cross seems to be like a twin to the Ruthwell Cross, but we don't see it in this name here where we would expect it, and we don't see it in this word either, but some people suppose that it might be in this word, but that wouldn't make any sense because this is not the context where we would expect to find the rune if it were an intentional invention meant to stand for an allophone of the k sound behind secondary fronted vowels. My fourth issue with the strange runic shape is that the actual appearance of this supposed rune is not as evidential as runologists have long assumed. Because the cross is damaged, the two supposed instances of the strange runic shape are quite hard to see, meaning we have to rely on flawed depictions of the cross from the 18th and 19th centuries. Although these old depictions largely agree with each other, there is significant disagreement in how they represent the second supposed instance of the strange runic shape. This part of the video was added later because I discovered this new depiction of the Ruthwell Cross, or rather, very old depiction. Okay, so N stands for Nicholson, D, Duncan, Gordon, Carlyle, Haig, and de Cardinal. And the really relevant thing about the new depiction is that I have reason to believe that all of the other depictions took at least some inspiration from it. Before I get to that, let's just look at the runic shape. So it supposedly shows up here, and you can see how people depicted it. All of them, except perhaps Duncan here, believe it takes on, the typical shape associated with the strange runic shape. If we look down here, though, we can see that some of the people who agree up here don't agree down here. So we have Carlyle, for example, we have Haig, and again, we seem to have Duncan. This is how the depictions are related. So we have Nicholson's depiction to begin with in George Hickes' Thesaurus. This Thesaurus was referenced by Carlyle, and so was Nicholson. Nicholson was also referenced by Gordon, who was somewhat aware of Nicholson's opinions on the runic inscription. We can see here that the de Cardinal depiction was supposed to be an improvement over the Gordon depiction, but maybe it still used the Gordon depiction as a reference or a base. So maybe de Cardinal borrowed from Gordon, and maybe Gordon borrowed from Nicholson. Down here, we can see that the Duncan depiction was done by someone familiar with Hickes and Gordon. And down here, we can see that the Haig depiction from George Stevens' Runic Monuments was also done under the knowledge of a bunch of other depictions like Duncan, Hickes, and de Cardinal. Additionally, all photographs of the cross I can find and the 3D rendering of the cross by the Visual Computing Lab of these guys do not show a second instance of the strange runic shape. Okay, so this is the side of the cross that I call the first runic half, or the first runic side. And over here is the first instance of the strange runic shape. So if you look at it, It's actually not very clear that it's there. It might be. I can definitely see three prongs like a calque, but I actually wonder if the rune itself isn't just a normal calque. Or maybe there's some strange modification to the top of it. One thing I suppose might be possible is the rune next to it. It looks kind of like a regular ur, when in theory it should be an ur. So it should have like a little line down here. But I'm thinking maybe they made a bind rune with the calque and put the little line on the calque instead of in the ur. That's just pure speculation, but that's kind of what it looks like. It's almost like there's a little line here and then a normal calque. I don't know. Whatever the case is, I don't really see the strange runic shape as it's commonly depicted. And the second instance is even trickier. So if you go down here to right here, this is where the second strange runic shape supposedly occurs. But if I use the light tool again, I really don't see it. I don't even see three prongs at the bottom. I see two prongs. And that is supported by two sketches. And one of the sketches doesn't see pockets. I don't see pockets or wings on the strange runic shape. So I'm supposing that this isn't even the strange runic shape a second time. I'm supposing it might be like a some kind of messed up chain rune or something like that. Here's a photograph I found of the second instance, or the second supposed instance, and I suppose this right here is the top half of the vertical staff, but I don't see a bottom half down here. I see kind of like an upside down Y shape down here. Looking at this spelling again, the chain at the end is also strange for two reasons. First, a lone ing rune without chain should have been enough to represent the ing segment there, as both manuscript rune lists and the rune's usage in Elder Futhorc indicate. It has been pointed out to me that some Old English Latin alphabet texts do use an equivalent Latin NGC trigraph for ing, and that this could explain the ing chain combination. This is possible, but it is worth noting that the Ruthwell Cross does not balk at using uniquely runic conventions elsewhere. The cross opts for ich rather than heil in the spelling of almighty. So if the cross is trying to use Latin-like spellings, they could have easily just used the runic H and mior, the Latin spelling, the Latin Old English alphabet spelling. The cross uses the letter gar, which has no Latin alphabet equivalent. The cross uses calque rod and calque win, where Old English Latin texts almost always use CR and CW. I have seen a KR in one manuscript, but I've never seen KWin in any Old English manuscripts. Okay, now the second suspicious thing is that there is a divot, a perhaps erroneous divot next to the chain, as though another rune were to be carved. This can be seen on the aforementioned 3D rendering and was noticed in several of the depictions of the cross from the 18th and 19th centuries. Elsewhere on the first runic half of the cross, there is a similar divot, also noticed in the 18th and 19th centuries, next to the yivu in Almechti. Interestingly, these divots are both in roughly the same spot relative to the runes. Okay, so if we go over here again and we look at the chain I'm talking about, you can see this divot here, you can see it here, you can see it here, and here. It was very well noticed by people. And if you look at the other divot I'm talking about, it's over here. It's right here, it's right here, it's right here, it's right here. It's almost like the carver were going to make a gar, and then he caught himself and didn't, because if he wrote almechtig, like that wouldn't make any sense, because the rune here should be making, if anything, it should be making like a y sound, almechtig, or it might even be a silent rune by this point in time, because the is rune here and the yiva rune here might just together be forming kind of a long e type sound. Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to look at the 3D rendering again. It's hard to see, but the divot for the chain is right here. And if you look at where it is, so if you think of runes as belonging to these kind of tall rectangles, then we can say the divot is in like the right central part of the rectangle. And that's the same place where we find the other divot in Almehti. Let's see here. Yeah, right here. So yeah, I think there's some evidence of some mistaken divots on the cross. Although maybe someone out there who's more familiar with the cross has some reason to believe that the divots are really, I don't know, natural, or maybe they weren't, carved by the carver. Maybe they were already there, or maybe they were part of the damage from the cross falling over or something. I don't know. Another suspicious spelling, somewhat isolated on the upper part of the eastern face, reads this. One interpretation is that this text, before being damaged, read this, and that this mirrors the text found in the Vercelli book. But if this is a spelling of this, then the carver has mistakenly used yivu instead of chain. So in other words, this should, in theory, say this. If the observations above are valid, and if there is a real pattern of the runes gar, kalk, yivu, and chain being fumbled on the Ruthwell Cross, perhaps it could be explained if we suppose that gar and kalk caused confusion because they were new inventions. This should be possible. The current dating scheme of known futhorc texts hints that gar and kalk may have been invented in the 8th century or late 7th century, and this is the same period the Ruthwell Cross text is dated to. In fact, it does not seem that gar and kalk ever reached the same level of familiarity as the older futhorc runes, and I give a bunch of examples of that, which I'm not going to bother reading out. But, in particular, this is interesting because in this manuscript, gar is wrongly transliterated as the Latin letter K, which might be basically the same kind of mistake that was made on the cross. And I also noticed this. Both supposed instances of the strange runic shape occur in words which also contain ing, and I imagine that could have added to the confusion.